Thanks for having us. We're going to dive right in because we've only got 42 minutes and 46 seconds. I'm joined by Oliver Darcy, the founder and author of Status, Sara Fischer, a media correspondent, the media correspondent for Axios, and Brian Stelter, the chief media analyst at CNN. These are three of the best media and news reporters in the country, in the world. Really excited to hear your insights. Let's just dive right in. Misinformation represents such a profound threat to democratic societies. It makes people doubt truth, facts, reality, and eventually it's not difficult to see how society starts fracturing. I want to ask, what do each of you see as the most dangerous, the most pernicious kind of misinformation in American society today? What really jumps out at you that everybody should be on everyone's radars? Oliver, can I start with you?
Sure. I would say, I guess, the President of the United States and his propaganda machine that is very good at disseminating lies and conspiracy theories to advance a political agenda and to seize power. So,
Sara?
I think when we talk about misinformation, a lot of the times we talk about the difference between mis and disinformation. Misinformation is regular, ordinary, everyday people inadvertently sharing the wrong thing. And I think that's become a lot easier to do with the rise of short form video and social media versus disinformation being, bad actors intentionally putting bad stuff out there. And I think misinformation is a real threat because that's what makes the disinformation go viral. And then the other thing I'd say is that when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, I think we think a lot about AI and deepfakes, and those do pose a threat. But in reality, the vast majority of mis and disinformation is just manipulated context. It's somebody posting an old photo or video and saying this happened yesterday, or it's somebody taking someone's actual remarks out of context and putting them in a situation where they have a different meaning. And that is some of the hardest stuff, Patrick, to police because it's kind of like half and half not.
Yeah. Right. Stelter?
I appreciated NAB this morning releasing some new numbers around this concern about AI and not being able to believe your own eyes and ears. Because it does feel like Sora 2 has been a real wake-up call for many people, both in our industry and then way outside our industry. It's telling that some of the biggest complaints you read on the Apple App Store from users of Sora 2 are from people who are mad about the guardrails. They want even more ability to make up even more BS. And in some cases, they're doing it for fun, right? They're doing it to entertain their friends. I found it to be very funny in some ways. But you're amused by it one minute and you're scared of it the next. And I think that's where we all are to some degree in this AI environment where we can kind of feel what's coming. We know we're only at a very early stage. We see the incredible opportunities, but the terrifying possibilities as well. And yet, it's not as if it's going to, you're not going to see government come to the rescue. You're not going to see these platforms, on their own just start to shut down the tools. The tools are going to be with us. And the NAB data got to this point about the importance of human interactions and people wanting to know where their content, their video, their shows are from. So I'm banking on that.
I'm banking on it too.
The rest of our careers, at least.
Look, the value of reporting comes from human-based news gathering. It comes from humans being on the ground in the Middle East, in Ukraine, in South Sudan, across America, who are talking to other human beings about what is happening. I want to pick up though on Oliver's point and maybe start with you, Brian, and then Sara, and talk about we do live in a country now where the President of the United States, in response to a reporter in Texas asking about the Texas flood accountability, said only a very evil person would ask a question like that. You have a White House press secretary who, in response to a question about why Budapest was chosen as the possible site for the Trump-Putin summit that's now off, who said, who picked Budapest? And the press secretary says, your mom did. We have congressional hearings where members of the administration are pushing back. How do you build resiliency into journalism and broadcasting when you have so much pressure, so
Right.
much misinformation, including coming from some of the most powerful people in the country?
I think number one, state it clearly, see it for what it is. Many, many bad faith actors trying to tear things down. That's why I love the way you opened, Oliver, like very clearly, here is the biggest threat. But then I think number two, to recognize what is in our control and what's outside our control, right? The first word of this particular panel is trust. Most of trust is gained or lost in a way that's out of our individual control. But we do each individually have a little bit of ability or power, responsibility. I think about it in football terms. I'm not gonna personally score a touchdown today for CNN. I'd love to, but all I can really do is get 1 inch down the field, right? I can help us get 1 inch further along toward the end zone, or I can help us fall back another inch or two, right? I can win a little bit of trust, or I can lose a little bit of trust, but it's going to be measured by inches. So I think it's important to be realistic, what is in our control and what is not. But then once we recognize what is in our control, what are journalists doing today? They're creating a record of all the indecency you just described, of all the ignorance and idiocy that you just described. We are creating a record for people to consider, and it still does matter. What happened? What was the headline on Politico this morning? It was about that Trump nominee who had shared racist texts, who had to withdraw his nomination, who's not going to get confirmed for the job. And that was entirely due to the news media's reporting. CNN was all over that. Politico was all over it. These stories do still matter sometimes. And whenever I see something like that happen, I take it to heart, not because I want to see that nomination fail, but because I want to see that real human-made journalism actually is still making an impact. Somebody is still reading it. And in that case, a certain number of Republican senators read it and said they couldn't stand for it, right?
It's accountability journalism, some of the most important stuff we do. Sarah, how about you? How do you see it?
I think in terms of building resilience, it comes down to the trust in institutions that hold people in power to account, whether that is the news media or that is local officials or that is your local police department. You want to have strong trust in institutions that are not necessarily governed by the executive branch to keep that power in check. And how do you develop strong trust in institutions? I think we're at a point now where the institutions need to take that on themselves by being overly transparent about the work they do, why they do it, how they spend their money. In the media industry as an institution, I look at the New York Times as a really great example of this. They have been trying to be much more transparent about how they get their stories, who are the types of sources that they talk to. If they can't name a source, why can't you name a source? What's the closest attribution you can give? A source familiar with the Justice Department's thinking because they worked on this project is a much stronger signal of trust than a source familiar. And so I think transparency at the institutional level will go a long way in helping Americans trust the institutions that are in charge of holding and checking power at the executive level.
And by the way, for those who don't know, Patrick is leading the way on this at the Times. That's the big part of your mandate, right? Is to figure out ways to tell the audience how we do what we do.
Yep.
What's been the biggest win for you so far?
Yeah, no, I want to answer that and come back to Oliver too. My job didn't exist 4 months ago. The executive editor of the New York Times, Joe Kahn, created an assistant managing editor position on our masthead for standards and trust. And trust is a key word there. We really understand, and I think Brian and Sara put it very well, that we have to do a better job about opening up our processes and showing how we do journalism, why we do what we do, why we choose to do certain stories the way that we do. So when we do a magazine cover story in the Times like we did in June on Benjamin Netanyahu and the decisions that he was making to extend the war in Gaza in order to protect his own hold on power, we're showing the sources, the reporting, the fact gathering that goes into that. We're not just asking people anymore, hey, we're the New York Times, trust us. We have work to do. Similarly, when we're showing how the movement of money has moved around the Middle East to support Hamas's hold in Gaza, including in some cases from the Israeli government in terms of how it was handling money going to the Palestinian Authority, showing that work. We can't just rely on a headline or on a basically a trust us kind of bargain in that way. I think, Brian, to your question, what we're trying to do more of now is bring reporters together to talk as candidly as we can, and we're getting used to this, about why we cover the Charlie Kirk assassination the way that we did. Why did we use the word charismatic to describe Charlie Kirk in a headline when some of our readers were saying, why aren't you using the word racist to describe Charlie Kirk in a headline? Talking about the news judgment that goes into those choices, because a lot of people have very different opinions about that. That's me taking up a little too much time.
There was an example I loved over the weekend from the Times during the No Kings protests. Y'all put up a story that said, we focus on the crowd's content and not the counting of the audience. We're not there to count how many people showed up at the rally. We're there to focus on what they're saying. Yeah, and you were preemptively explaining why you weren't going to say the number of million who showed up, because we don't know how many million showed up.
I said that we send out more than 20 reporters to sites around the country to cover the No Kings protests, more than 12 photographers around the country to cover it. And we had to ask ourselves the question, are we going to spend time trying to verify crowd count numbers, or are we going to be talking to people in the crowd about why they showed up, about what they care about the most? So that is a trade-off. And look, some people were upset that we didn't label and put a number on the crowd count, and we deal with that. I believe in that kind of engagement where we're held accountable. But Oliver, you write a lot in holding to account politicians, networks, news organizations, including the Times, about basically judgment calls, about why we platform what we platform, information that comes out. How do you see, I'm curious, the resiliency question in journalism? Because, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, if we're only speaking, let's say just at the Times, to one audience or to one side of the country, we feel, you miss things that are happening. You just invariably do. But how do you build resiliency? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's great that the New York Times and other organizations are being transparent and trying to talk to audience and explain their decision making. I don't really see how that is going to increase trust amongst, a good percentage of the population that probably supports the president, probably watches someone like Sean Hannity. Like the Sean Hannity audience is probably not going to the NewYorkTimes.com and seeing how you are being transparent about how you're gathering news. They're listening to Sean Hannity frame a story in a specific way, likely dishonestly, and then hating the New York Times as a result, also because they've been listening to him do that for the past 10 and 20 years. So my thought on resiliency and building trust is, I think the trend that we're seeing today is news organizations, largely led by corporations or billionaires, try to cater coverage to people who have been trained in a lot of ways to hate them. So you're seeing this at Paramount with CBS News, I think. You're seeing this at the Los Angeles Times, perhaps a little bit at the Washington Post on the editorial side, and elsewhere, where owners are thinking, how do we get like the Republicans to like us? And the fact is that the Republicans, or a lot of them, are never going to like you guys. Like they not only actively are not going to subscribe, I think I told you this, Patrick, to the New York Times. They want to see the New York Times fail. They want to see it ash. They want to ship the ash to outer space. Like they do not want the New York Times to be successful. And when you are trying to sometimes win over coverage from that audience by softening coverage of Donald Trump or by softening coverage of Charlie Kirk, because you're afraid of offending them, what actually happens is you lose trust amongst the people who actually rely on the New York Times and like the New York Times or CNN or the Washington Post or the LA Times. And I think you've actually seen some data on this recently, or to some extent, which is that when Patrick Soon-Shiong meddles at the Los Angeles Times, they lose subscribers. When Jeff Bezos meddles at the Washington Post, they lose subscribers. They're not gaining subscribers. They're losing subscribers. Frankly, at CNN, when the coverage got softened with Donald Trump, ratings have slid considerably. And so if you are trying to win trust, I think you don't soften coverage to cater to an audience. That's not what news organizations are supposed to do. They're supposed to relay facts as they are. And if they offend people, they offend people. And if you do that, if you end up trying to cater coverage to an audience that is never going to like you, you actually lose trust amongst the audience that already does want to subscribe to your product. And that's actually, I think, the thing that's not being talked about enough.
Brian,
can I
it looks like you want to weigh in.
Well, can I just complicate it a little bit though, Oliver?
Sure.
There's a big difference between a MAGA loyalist who has voted for Trump 3 times, who believes that he won an election he lost in 2020 and only trusts Newsmax, versus a what I would describe, dare I say, as a more normal Republican who does support some of what Trump does and dislikes other things Trump does, and actually still does check in to CNN or check into the New York Times. I'm not saying they trust all of it, but there still are those Republicans. I want to give them some credit.
I think that's
There's actually a lot of them.
Very small.
I don't want you to give up on them.
I mean, look how many people did not believe the results of the 2020 election. Like the number of Republicans were, you know, that you're describing are shrinking every single day. I agree that they used to be there.
Yes, they are.
But if we are looking at the data, I think it reflects a very different Republican Party that's been radicalized by people. And I think if you look at like someone like Alex Jones, used to be on the fringes of politics,
sure,
or Tucker Carlson,
sure,
or these people have been welcomed into the mainstream largely by the president, propped up by the president. Look what they're doing in the Pentagon today, announcing the new Pentagon press corps, which is a bunch of right-wing wackos. And that's like the mainstream Republican. You're talking about outliers in the Republican Party.
But I would make the argument that there are lots and lots of Trump voters who still want to know what is true in the world. And they are not always thrilled by every single thing the administration does. They do actually object to some of the things that have happened. At the same time, we should recognize there are lots of Trump voters who have good reason to be disappointed by the mainstream media, who did feel let down during the pandemic, who did feel lied to at certain moments. And not every objection is rooted in disinformation. I just think there's value in meeting people where they are, knowing where they're coming from, and recognizing that we're all of us, trying to figure out what's true in the world.
Sara,
and yes, the propaganda machine is a big problem at the same time.
Sara, I want to bring you into this, because you report part on media companies, broadcasters, news organizations, and I'm curious how much pressure you hear from your sources that people feel like they're under, and some of the points that Oliver and Brian are getting into. And if we can be really candid about it, what, if any, signs you're seeing of news organizations and broadcasters massaging, softening, skewing what they do because of a fear-based climate or real not just fear, but real pressure?
The list that Oliver just described of the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post losing subscribers. There's another one I would add to that list, which was data that came out yesterday or 2 days ago, that Disney lost subscribers in the wake of canceling Jimmy Kimmel. The reason I bring that to you is because you talk about that Republican that Brian is speaking of. Most people, and the data backs this wildly, trust their local broadcaster more than any other type of media. There's actually a split in their minds between the mainstream news and their local WTV, whatever it is. They trust their local news stations. And so what was very hard for me to swallow around the Kimmel situation was what you saw was the capitulation of local broadcasters who have long been some of the most trusted institutions coming out and saying, we support the cancellation, or actually prompting the cancellation because they now are facing business challenges and need FCC approval for mergers and consolidation. So that's one big example. And then another example that often gets forgotten, but is so critical. In fact, maybe one of the most important examples was the shift right by Televisa Univision. And that matters because Univision was this very sort of left-leaning voice for the Hispanic population, which has since shifted right. So it makes sense that they would want to shift right.
Yep.
But the timing of it was very interesting. Televisa is like the Comcast of Mexico. They took over Univision in 2022, and they haven't been shy about saying, like, we want to bring Univision more to the center right. Normally, that doesn't throw up that many red flags. But in this case, the reason to me it's interesting is one, Univision is a public broadcaster. Okay. So they rely on spectrum that is owned by the U.S. taxpayer that they license. And two, Televisa is a foreign company that has interests outside of just their Univision asset. So them, trying to shift the Univision product into the center, which again, editorially, I do understand because the Hispanic population has shifted that way.
Yeah.
But you also have to consider the value add of them becoming closer to the Trump administration could transcend, getting media stuff approved.
Yep.
And so that's a very salient example. And by the way, I actually really like their CEO. I like Daniel Alegre. I think he does a fantastic job, but it's a salient example of one to watch because it often gets forgotten because it's a Spanish language broadcaster, but it's the largest Spanish language broadcaster in the United States.
That's good. I want to go back to Jimmy Kimmel for a minute and go to Brian and Oliver. What do you see, if any, as knock-on effects, as the fallout from the Kimmel experience for the credibility and the independence of broadcasters, of major media organizations, of how the public basically sees some of those CEO decisions? Brian, do you want to go first?
I think there was a very valuable lesson from Kimmelgate, and I think it's been internalized by a lot of media executives and by a lot of journalists in local newsrooms, that there will be a backlash when you appear to be capitulating to the government. Right now it happens to be the Trump government, but it could also be a future president. If you look like you're giving in to political pressure, there will be a backlash. There will be a punishment from the consumers. That was very, very loud and clear. And, I think that has been internalized. And I think it also gets back to the broader question about restoring trust and confidence. As Sara was saying, that local connection is so valuable. And it's what gives me the most hope, when I get really, really pessimistic about the state of journalism. It's that when there is a tornado warning or a flood warning, almost everybody still trusts their local meteorologist. That's what gives me it sounds pretty simple, I know, but it's true. That local connection is so valuable. In fact, it's probably going to be more valuable in an environment where you have so many grifters and liars and AI robots that are manipulating most of the content around you.
Yep.
Look at all this, made up information about weather and hurricanes in the last couple of years. It makes that local weatherman connection even more valuable.
Can I just add one thing to that? Totally agree with Brian, especially in the AI era. Remember when there was those big floods in Asheville? It was the local reporters that were coming out and saying what was real versus what was AI. But on the Kimmel thing, we have a big red line now that has been drawn in the free speech debate, which is that Republicans came out and said you went too far, Chairman Carr, who's the chairman of the FCC. Ted Cruz and Senator Thune and others said, wait a minute, this is getting into an area where you are overstepping your bounds, fellow Republican. It's the first time I saw a free speech line actually get written across the Republican Party. So that also gives me hope.
Oliver?
Oh, I guess what I would say is journalists, journalistic institutions, media institutions, I think people look to them to hold power to account. And so when they bow to power, when they give into it, when they acquiesce to it, that results in backlash. And because it goes to the core values of the organization. And so, if you are the Washington Post and your slogan is democracy dies in darkness and you are caving to President Trump, not because he has a good point, but because he's trying to bully you into getting good coverage, that is going to result in backlash. When you are Disney and, you've arguably already caved once with the ABC News settlement with George Stephanopoulos, and then you just pull your late night host off the air, Jimmy Kimmel, arguably the most recognizable talent at ABC, because the FCC chairman is like bullying you on some right-wing podcast, that's going to result in a really angry consumer base. And I think, again, the people that are watching Jimmy Kimmel and the people that are probably subscribing to Disney, a lot of them at least, are people who don't want to see that. Like that's not what they want to see. They want to see Jimmy Kimmel on air giving the president hell every night, just frankly like he gave Biden hell every night. It wasn't like these guys were soft on Biden.
I just want to pick up on that and something Brian said, which is the key dynamic that happens when you cave to power. When power is trying to challenge your independence in journalism and you cave to it. I have to say, the New York Times White House reporters dealing with the Trump White House and the Trump press office has been pretty professional by and large. When we ask questions or we seek information, we get a response. Our situation with the Biden White House was frankly much more difficult. And the amount of pressure that the Times and others came under for our reporting about the fact that Joe Biden was asking the American people to reelect him and make him the oldest president in the history of this country. And the reporting that we did about his age and his cognitive abilities came in for a hell of fire. There was enormous pressure from Biden and from the Democratic Party. Biden would joke about it, openly at the White House Correspondents' Dinner and elsewhere about Times reporting about his age. So that the reporting, the tough reporting that we do on President Trump and President Biden can just lead to that kind of pressure. And we all know this. We all know this. When you start caving, when you start preemptively bending the knee just out of fear, it just hardens the determination of authority to chip away further at your independence. And I'm just really curious because we talk a lot at the New York Times about independent journalism, but I am curious about this question around trust and credibility of our independence. A lot of people don't see the media as independent. They see the media as taking sides, as having bias, whether it's in politics or Israel, Gaza, or kind of other storylines. What do you see as what media organizations can or need to do, what journalism can or need to do in order to protect our own independence? And I throw it open. Anyone have a thought on that?
Well, it starts with narrowing down what we mean by media, because Jimmy Kimmel is media, but not news. There's even a lot of news that's not really journalism, telling me what's going on and what the weather's going to be. We can debate the nuances, but that real core of journalism, holding power to account, it's a very small sliver of the wider media world. And I think a lot of people who argue against the media, they're really actually mad about TikTok influencers, or they're mad about Fox News or MSNBC hosts, or maybe me, I don't know. But you know what I'm saying? There's an important distinction to make within that. I think we can, within our own individual stories or our individual videos or our individual newsletters, provide signals of trust. And that's where I think we go back to the winning inch by inch and trying to earn people's trust back.
Yeah.
One of the best things I see happening right now, whether it's a New York Times homepage video where you see the reporter, or it's Oliver or Sara writing in their own voices and their own words in the first person in their newsletters, that kind of engagement where it's much more personal and conversational, I think that's going a long way toward fixing what's been broken. We've all decried the voice of God thing for decades now, but now there's actually an alternative. It's holding your phone up to your face and talking in a very personal way. And there's a reason why people trust that more than they tend to trust the 800-word articles that I'm used to writing.
Yeah.
So I find that to be a hopeful sign that people do want that much more conversational approach.
Yep.
I have found as far as I push it, I should always push myself further. Mm-hmm. People want me to go even further, to be more human when I'm on air or writing, because that's what they trust more.
Yeah. Can I bring the social media platforms and the tech companies into this? And I'll put my thumb on the scale. We need these platforms and these companies to prioritize fact-based, truth-based, independent journalism, I think, more than they do now. This is a place where misinformation, online harassment, sort of challenges, limits, online attacks on journalists are just only on the rise. Is that possible? I don't want to use the cliche, the horse is out of the barn, but what can we expect, if anything, from the platforms? Sara?
I have a very strong opinion on this, which is the platforms as publicly traded behemoths that now argue in front of Congress, we are part of your national security solution against China. They are driven by market outcomes. So if there's market demand for high quality content, that's what they're going to respond to. If there is not market demand for elevating truthful, high quality content, they will not respond to it. Now, the question becomes, okay, so as a society then, should we then regulate them like utilities, which do not get held to account the types of content that is pumped through their airwaves? That is a question as society that we can ask ourselves, and we can try to elect people who will put those policies into action. But we are so far from that. I think right now, the best way to get platforms to do that is to give them market incentive that they don't have. I will tell you, though, I've seen a few optimistic signs that there's a little more market incentive than maybe we give them credit for. And let me explain what those are. Google, in their search results, the biggest thing that they use to figure out what to elevate is what's a term called relevancy. Is it timely? Does it answer your questions? All of that. In a search query, there might be a content that is not as journalistic, but more relevant to answering someone's question than the original source of the report. For example, if the New York Times did a 30,000 story, and then the bottom line said, broke news that Crayola's new color is macaroni and cheese, and HuffPost wrote MYT : Crayola's new color is mac and cheese. Google, from a relevancy perspective, in response to a query about what's Crayola's new color, would be incentivized to bump HuffPost. They changed that. Google has changed that. They have now made the original source of the report higher up in their results. Why? There's a market demand for it. People they found were clicking through that first intermediate article to the original source. So the way that you get tech companies, in my opinion, to respond to elevate quality is the market demand. And by the way, we're seeing it in other little areas. For example, why is Patreon and OnlyFans and Substack, why are they doing so well? They're doing so well because these big tech platforms that are ad-based refuse to carry some of the point of view and content that these other platforms are comfortable with. There's the obvious extreme examples like adult content, but there are less extreme examples like Nazi content. So I think that the hope is that the market can be the forcing mechanism for these platforms to make decisions to elevate high quality. In absence of a market solution, though, you need a regulatory solution. And how do you get a regulatory solution? The voters. So it really is on us.
I do think that if in 2028, if we have a presidential election, if we're not talking about banning cell phones in schools and we're not talking about regulatory solutions to this society's big tech addiction, social media hurting us, then we've wasted another election. It's got to be front and center in 2028. But you made me hungry with the mac and cheese thing. I want to point out it gets to this core idea, the most valuable thing we all do as journalists. It's putting out new bits of information into the world, right? Whether that's buried at the bottom of the story or whether it's in the headline. So we think about how to regain trust and regain confidence. It's to put out new information in the world. And if that comes front and center, then we win. But Oliver and I have argued for years. When we worked together at CNN, we would stand at our cubicles and we would debate what to do about Twitter because you're not on X anymore, right, Oliver?
Nope.
So I know you have a strong feeling about this platform question.
Yeah, I mean,
he says I should not be on X either, but
yeah, I mean, I don't know why anyone's on X. I kind of get it, but I think it's, I don't want to be contributing to Elon Musk's like big cog in his machine. And so I've decided not to do that. And, I don't see why news organizations are on a platform that actually hates them and, not blocks their content, but has delayed your content or, done a bunch of stuff.
But like Patrick said, we also need them.
Throttles.
But we also need these platforms.
No, you don't. You don't need X. No, definitely not. I mean, I don't know how much traffic is driven to the New York Times from X, but it's not that. It's probably irrelevant. I mean, you don't need it. But
it's not what it once was.
Yeah, it's definitely not what it once was, and it never was really great. I mean, always Facebook and Google were much higher. So I don't actually know why platforms are on a platform that hates them, but they're free to make that decision. I think one thing that we haven't talked about though, in terms of the tech companies, is if you want to know why they get away with so much, frankly, news organizations are not aggressive enough in covering them. And I often think about this, if you watch the news, any channel, there's a correspondent at the Pentagon. No, maybe not anymore, actually. Sorry. There was correspondents at the Pentagon, not anymore, but there's someone at Capitol Hill. There's someone at the White House. There's, a whole bunch of correspondents fanned out across DC. I don't know why there's not a correspondent at Menlo Park. or Mountain View or, doing a stand-up.
We got plenty. Oh,
Well,
talking about TV.
I'm talking about TV.
Okay.
The visuals of having a correspondent outside Menlo Park and saying, this is what Mark Zuckerberg has done today.
Sure.
I think that news organizations are actually trained to cover power in New York and Washington. And for some reason that has not necessarily translated to Silicon Valley. And until you have like microphones in the faces of people and you really cover them the same way. I mean, you look at any network.
You love making people sweat.
Think about any network though. I mean, we won't pick on CNN, but they have usually dozens of politics reporters. Maybe if you're lucky, a dozen, maybe if you're lucky, reporters covering the most powerful companies, the most powerful people on earth who have immense amounts of wealth. It's crazy. And then the other thing I'd say too, the final thing is you have to actually describe in clear terms what they're doing. Elon Musk is always described as like a billionaire businessman, never as a right-wing conspiracy theorist, even though that man has promoted so many conspiracy theories, so much misinformation, and yet he gets soft glove treatment by the press. And so you want to know why voters maybe don't do things at the polls. It's because they're not getting information from the outlets that they count on to deliver that information that's clear and even shining through
I strongly disagree on Elon Musk. I think he's been aggressively
does the New York Times call him a right-wing conspiracy theorist, Patrick?
We've written about the conspiracy theories as push, but I think it's important also
but never in shorthand. It's never in shorthand. It's always, Alex, we've talked about this too.
We have disagreed about this.
Yeah, Alex Jones is called a right-wing conspiracy theorist, and he's the only one for some reason. But anyone else who does the same stuff, the same behavior, who is actually more powerful, far more powerful, they are always referred to as the billionaire businessman or, the SpaceX owner, and never for what the corrosive things they're doing in society are. And I do not understand why that is.
Sarah, I want to let
I've
you
come to find, I agree with Oliver that I don't think that the attention to holding people to account in the private sector is the same as the public, in parts because there hasn't been decorum established around press conferences and things like that creates TV moments for the press to cover. But I do think where I've seen a lot of the tech reporting is fear mongering around kids. This kid killed themselves because they were bullied on social media. This kid became addicted on Snapchat to fentanyl. And we see tons of those stories. But to Oliver's point, it's not, when you're doing one of those stories, there's not like a big picture of Adam Mosseri, the CEO or the head of Instagram associated, right? It's just like the sad photo of the kid with their mom before they died. And so I think drawing that association, in the same way that we do to public officials, that I do think that would make a impact.
Isn't it crazy that most people don't know the name of the TikTok CEO, even though that's one of the most influential platforms on the face of the planet, or even who Adam Mosseri is? That's a big failure, I'd say, from, news organizations.
Yeah, we should have learned that from Too Big to Fail, and sort of the banking crisis is we did learn who all those executives were after the fact.
We only have a few minutes left, and I want to talk a little bit about solutions. Brian talked about, in terms of the real decline in trust in media and journalism, credibility, news organizations. Brian talked about the importance of pointing out new information as something that does build and gain trust. We talked a little bit about accountability, journalism. I'm curious what else you all see as solutions that media organizations can do, that journalism can do, including things that we've gotten wrong in the past that that you think could build trust. And it's not just trust with the left. It's trust with an audience, because the Times, at least, and I think all of us are looking for as full and comprehensive an audience as possible.
Yes, and I think there's two words that come to my mind. One is subscriptions, the other is fandom. Fandom might be obvious, but people have really powerful parasocial relationships with their local TV hosts, with their, in some cases, newsletter writers that they subscribe and pay for. Those relationships are a way to build and regain trust. Those relationships are going to be harnessed more in the future because we're going to be more on those individual relationships and less about the institutional ones. But I think the big word is subscription. The subscription revolution is the opportunity in front of all of us in different ways to bring people in. And look, if you're paying for it, you're going to rely on it more. You're going to trust it more. You're going to have higher expectations, right? CNN's launching its version of an all access tier next week, where you'll be able to get, you'll get CNN's channels as well as the website and all the rest. We're a subscriber model. still on cable as well, but having an alternative to cable. These pathways, whether it's through Substack or Patreon, or whether it's a New York Times or CNN subscription, to me, these are critical to regaining trust. Because if you're putting $5 or $10 a month toward a product, you are going to have higher expectations of it. You are going to expect them to spell your name right, or get the title right, or cover the story you care about. But you're also able to put your money where your mouth is, and so I think there's a real upending of the industry. And Oliver's going through this firsthand with Status, getting people to pay every day. So are you, Sarah, with Media Pro Trends. People are paying, and that changes the relationship with the consumer. So to me, that's the root of all of this, really.
Sara, thoughts on sort of solutions for in the trust space, rebuilding credibility, or things journalism needs to get right on?
I think two things can be true at once. You can have a billionaire business person also be a right-wing conspiracist. And so figuring out how do you communicate both of those things in a way that is of equal weight is really critical. One of the things I've tried to do is I cover fringe outlets on both sides of the political aisle from a business lens, and I am not afraid to say this outlet, which can dive into conspiracy theories, is an incredibly successful business. And that builds trust because people recognize that I'm not poo-pooing them for, being what they are. But I can still call out some of the credibility of the content. And I think just having that dual hat is really helpful. Now, if you are a media critic and it's your job, to call out, mis and disinformation primarily, as opposed to for me, if you can't tell, I love the free markets versus regulation policy wonk hat. You might have to take a different lens and approach, but I think it's good to have both that media critic type of lens, but also the lens that I bring, which is, you kind of have to look at these things with complete sobriety. If it's a good business, call it out for being a good business, even if it delves into sort of conspiracies and things like that.
Oliver, you've got the last word.
Wow, big shoes to fill. I guess what I would say is sort of a continuation of what I said throughout this panel is don't cater coverage, don't bend coverage. That does not win you trust. I think even when I write, I'm probably one of the harsher critics of some of these folks. Those people still read us, read Status. You'll be shocked to know a lot of Republicans read Status, even though I'm very critical of a lot of things that are happening in this country. And I think it's because they know that there's that we're calling things for what they are. And I think people actually respect that, and you get more trust when you just call balls and strikes accurately, when you don't try to give one side favorable treatment in an effort to win them over. And so I would urge news organizations and reporters to just say what's happening. Do your job. Don't add any extra, don't soften coverage for anyone because you want them to be a source or a friend or whatever. Just say what's happening. I think that's really the best way to earn trust. A lot of things are out of your control too. And, yeah.
Oliver, Darcy, Sara, Fischer, Brian Stelter, thanks so much for
Patrick.
joining us.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Hope you
you
have
all.
a great conference.